Well, I'm John Gregg, and I'm on the porch, and we're glad you joined us. But you know what? A funny thing happened. Before the pandemic, we made a few classic episodes. Some things are different, mainly the way I looked, so see if you can spot it, but stay tuned. Glad you've joined us. I don't know about you, but at the end of the day, I'm tired, I'm thirsty, and just like to sit down and visit. So, as you know, you're always welcome here on the front porch. And I'm going to go freshen up my iced tea, and we'll join each other in a moment. Tom, I'm so glad you made a return visit back here to the front porch at Sanborn.
Always a good time.
Well, I'm glad you say so. It makes me feel good. But, you know, you and I are about the same age, and I'm sure you can start reminiscing the older we get. I was thinking about a story the other day that involved me and a painful lesson on honesty that involved my mother. And it would have been probably summer 1961, 62. I'd finished the first or second grade, and my outfit back then consisted, when school was out and in the summer, were just a little pair of shorts, no shoes, no socks, no shirt. Sanborn was a town, instead of 350 people, had about 600, and like little towns like Freelandville, where your family's from, we still had a downtown. And I got up, and what I'd normally do was somewhere around 9 o'clock, I would go over to the elevator where my grandmother worked as a bookkeeper, and I'd get the mail, or I'd get the key to go get the mail. And then I got this little satchel, and it had a deposit in it. Like, if you can imagine this, letting a little 6-year-old kid walk with money to the bank, and I'd deposit it there. I'd go and get the mail. So I had done that. I had stopped and saw Grandma and P-Bud over at the elevator, and I'd gone and saw Judy and Claude down at the bank, and went to the post office and saw a woman named Nancy Richards. And when I get home, my mother looked at me and she said, "What's that in the corner of your mouth?" Understand I didn't have a mustache then. And I said, "It's nothing, it's nothing, you know." I'm licking my mouth. And she said, "What is that?" And I said, "Well, I had a donut." "A donut? Where'd you get money for a donut?" Well, we had 2 grocery stores back then. One of them was owned by Clarence Gregory. He was family. And I said to Mom, I said, "Cousin Clarence gave me a donut." And my mother said, "Cousin Clarence doesn't give donuts." And I said, "Yes, he did." And I started to get all upset, and she could tell I had lied. She said, "You stole that donut, didn't you?" Put her finger right in my face, grabbed me by the forearm, and off we went. I mean, we went across our yard, around the picket fence, into Dr. Lawless's yard, down the hill across Ray and Ruth Shanks' front yard, past the post office, past the old Sinclair station, into the grocery store. By this time, I am a bawling like there's no tomorrow. I'm just a wailing and crying. We go in, and Clarence is there, and he wore a smock, and Clarence was about 70 at the time, and he says, "June, what's wrong?" And she said, "Clarence, this boy of mine here, he's a thief. He stole a donut from you. You tell him what you did." And I'm, "Oh," you know, crying and all this. Mom says, "You tell him what you did." So I looked up at him and I said, "Clarence, when I came in the store and you weren't here, I grabbed a donut and ate it." And my mother said, "He's a thief, and he's got to tell you he's wrong, and he's not going to do that again." And I'm just bawling, the tears falling down my face. Mom's hollering, and Clarence says, "June, take it easy on him. I'm sure he won't do it again." And I learned something. First of all, I never stole another donut, as you can well imagine. Second of all, I learned that if you tell a tale, your mother, and my mother can still do it, can tell when you're telling a big hard story, big fib. And learned a painful lesson as a young kid. But when I'm thinking of summertime, I always think of being a little kid, and it's just always kind of good to reminisce and remember some of the things you learned from a family as a kid. always like it when friends drop by the front porch to sit and visit. Makes me feel good, and I always learn something. And today I've got a good friend, Tom Roznowski, stopped by. He's a Hoosier author, lecturer, musician, storyteller. I can tell you, as a bad politician, I got in trouble for telling stories, and you make a living at it. There's just no justice. Well, let me tell you, Tom, I love this book. It's about Terre Haute in 1927, Crossroads of America. And I got to tell you, as a little kid growing up at Sanborn, where I still live, right here, that's why we love to have you come down. We would go 45 miles up the road to Terre Haute. We'd go up there to Meese, Roots, Schultz, Levin Brothers, and do our school shopping. And when we get there, we were such farm kids. My mother would entertain us. The Root store just had two floors, but they had an escalator. You'd go up the top one, down the second one, and just up and down. And we'd ride those escalators. My brother James and I rode those escalators for hours. But your book brings back a golden time in the history of Indiana and Terre Haute, and I don't think people realize what a community Terre Haute was back then.
You know, John, you mentioned it being the crossroads of America, and in a lot of ways, it really did bring together disparate parts of the American experience. Rural, urban, the global, the local, everything seemed to come together in Terre Haute, and as a river town, it had such interesting characters. That's what made it easy to write the book.
You know, a lot of times we don't think of southern Indiana, and this is southern Indiana, being diverse, but they had a Jewish community, they had a Middle Eastern, Greek, Lebanese,
right.
Syrian community, something that you didn't have a lot of in Indiana at that time. But what a retail and industrial hub back then.
That's right, and one of the things that really fascinates me about Terre Haute in those days is that all of these elements, where you're talking about the industrial or the agricultural, it was all self-contained within Terre Haute. As late as 1940, half of the food that was consumed in Terre Haute was grown on area farms. And they had a number of food processors in Terre Haute, some of the names you remember, Clabber Girl,
the Holman family, the Dauntless,
Farmer's Pride.
Farmer's Pride, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so you had this almost vertical economy where the food would be grown, it would be sent to Terre Haute, processed into canned vegetables, and I think that really helped the integrity of the town.
Was there much commercial or any commercial river traffic in the 20s, or had that already passed?
Well, you know, up until 1930, the Army Corps of Engineers used to dredge the bottom of the Wabash River, remove debris and so forth. So some of the mid-sized craft would have draft that would be capable of getting them from Terre Haute up to, say, Montezuma. And they did have excursion boats. That's an amazing thought, isn't it, to have an excursion boat on the Wabash River. But really what you're talking about as one of the great American rivers. I think next to the Mississippi, maybe, no river has been written about or sung about as much as the Wabash.
Well, our state song,
right.
which many get confused thinking it's back home again in Indiana, but somebody like you and I know that now do you pronounce it Dresser or Dreiser?
Dresser. Now Dreiser is the German, and of course his brother Theodore was a great author.
Kind of scandalous for his day.
He was.
Yeah.
He was.
And
it was quite a family. And the amazing thing about on the banks of the Wabash, far away, when you set it in context, it sold over 1 million copies when it was released. But remember, that's 1 million copies of sheet music.
Yep.
There were no recordings back in 1897.
And there probably weren't, what, 50, 60 million people in the country back then?
Exactly.
And you know, I was a little aware of that fact. It was literally the most popular song when they counted up the volume of records or sheet music, pardon me, sold in that century. That's just
that's exactly
amazing.
Right. And you think too about the fact that anyone who purchased it had to know how to read music, or at least know someone who could read music. And so much of it was performed. This was before Victrolas. It was before radio, the ways that we access music now.
Sure.
So that's how people heard music, was just the way that
In the parlor.
in the parlor, live. There
On
was
kind of on
somebody
the
in
front
an
porch,
extended
yeah.
family that could scrape on a fiddle or play some
Absolutely.
piano.
I saw a picture one time of Paul Dreiser, and he was a full-size man.
He was.
He was. I like standing by people like him. It makes me look lean and trim. But no, I love that story of him. You mentioned colorful family. Even in your book, the pictures at the Terre Haute with its retail history, that whole idea of what they've done from agricultural, and then of course basketball, local sports teams, baseball, just an unbelievable community.
Sure. A great baseball history. They used to have a minor league team there, of course, and the St. Louis Cardinals in their championship year of 1926 came to play in Terre Haute, Indiana.
Wow.
An exhibition. They were traveling by train from St. Louis to Pittsburgh, and the owner of the team figured, here's a way to keep my boys busy and make a little money. So they played the Terre Haute minor league team in Memorial Stadium.
Wow, that is something to think of. There's so many stories like that that's why I love having folks just drop by and visit that just get kind of lost. And when you hear that, I'll remember that the 26 Cardinals played in Terre Haute, and we'll pass that on to Cardinal fans in the future. There's just so many fascinating things about Indiana that we forget and people don't know about. And here's probably something you didn't know about Indiana. I never tire of visiting or talking about Indiana. And with your book on Terre Haute, with my background, I always like to talk a little bit about politics. And in my lifetime, they've produced some colorful characters, but a person who was on the cutting edge and viewed by some Americans as a troublemaker in his day was Eugene V. Debs.
That's right.
40-hour work week, something we take for granted today. Some paid vacation, pensions, health care, things that he ended up going to prison at one time. So tell me a little bit about Debs, because he's identified with Terre Haute, and I think a lot of Hoosiers don't know it or they don't want to remember it. And what he stood for then is taken for granted today.
You're absolutely right, John. And it has taken well over 100 years for a lot of the things that Eugene Debs espoused to just be seen as common sense, an end to child labor, for instance. I think Debs went to work for the railroad, cleaning grease off of locomotives when he was 13 years old. And his father gave him a middle name of Victor because he was so enthralled with the writings of Victor Hugo. So even though this was a working class family, they had a great devotion to the classics and to learning. So as you know, Debs, while he was not conventionally schooled, was a man who really treasured knowledge.
Absolutely.
And that was part of his message to people.
Well, I think a lot of people forget that, the building trades and all of those people back then, a lot of the people were very much self-taught, reading. Right. I often think of the cigar makers and the hat makers having somebody read to them while they worked. As I recall, Debs went to prison, and one of our, you and I and Americans today are real familiar how we interred the Japanese in World War II. Debs was a socialist, and he went to prison for his political beliefs during World War I, didn't he?
That's right. He gave a speech in Canton, Ohio, where he criticized the involvement of the United States in World War I. And based on that speech, he was convicted of sedition and imprisoned in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary At the time, he was in his late 60s, and I think the stint in prison, which went over a period of almost 3 years, really affected his health. When he was released, he was pardoned by Warren Harding, who was president at the time. And a couple days after Christmas...
He was a crook. He should have pardoned him. But go ahead.
He allowed Debs to come back to Terre Haute, where he lived. And there are different stories about this, a little film footage, but apparently there are some accounts that as many as 10,000 people showed up at the Union Station train station to greet Debs when he stepped off the train.
You know, he ran for president 4 or 5 times, but either in like 1912 or 1916, he got almost 10% of the vote. I mean, there was one of those years that he got an astronomically high number of votes. People probably don't know it, but the city of Bicknell, right here in my home county of Knox, had a socialist mayor. You had socialists elected to city councils all across the country. And the powers to be, you know, the ruling class, the establishment, guys like Debs talking stuff like that with workers' rights and all, it scared them. And that's a bad mark on history, you know, when we jail people for expressing their thoughts.
Well, there are 2 things I think you can say about Eugene Debs. One, he always stood up for the working man and the working women of the United States. And also another thing, apparently he was great with kids, which
really?
is a nice thing to be said about a man.
Absolutely.
He was gentle. His body, after he died in Chicago, actually, at a medical facility up there, and his body came back to Terre Haute and lay in state at the local Union Hall. And you can imagine that, just 3 days, lines of people passing the casket and paying their respects to a man who always lived in Terre Haute. In fact, as you know, his home is still standing and is a museum these days.
It's well worth seeing, and it's like a lot of our Hoosier homes. You know, in my home county, we've got William Henry Harrison's home. Indianapolis has Benjamin Harrison home. You've got a Dan Quayle facility, a former vice president. You've got presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs. You can go to Rushville and see where Wendell Willkie was born, another presidential contender. And I think a lot of Hoosiers don't see those, and they're missing something, you know?
They are.
They really are.
I'm a big believer, as you are, John, that it's really important to know your local heritage, your local history.
Absolutely.
Because I think it helps illuminate where you are in the present and where you'll be going in the future.
Well, I want you to come back and visit with me some other time, because I want to talk about the river, I want to talk a little bit about Miram.
Sure.
But you're a musician.
Yes, sir.
What do you play?
Well, I play guitar, piano, blow on a little harmonica, and I write original tunes. So I always say to people, most of the stories in this book are short form. I think 3.5 minutes is my time signature. That's where I feel comfortable writing. So whether it's a song or a story or the work I do on the radio, somehow it always tends to wind up around 3.5 minutes.
And your radio show?
Porch Light with Tom Roznowski is on WFIU, which is a public radio affiliate of the Indiana Broadcast System. And it's on 8 o'clock Saturday evenings.
Well, you know what? Porch Light, Front Porch, it's all about relationships, visiting, learning about our roots, and love talking about that music, and just reminds me of my favorite instrument, banjo, so you're getting close. Well, the banjo is the only American instrument, although many people say it has African roots, which it does, but I love to hear banjo music. Got with me my buddy here today, Sam Bartlett, and Sam is a banjo picker. What are you going to play for me today?
Amazing Grace and Hollow Poplar.
Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, but before you pick it, what is this thing?
Well, that is a parlor panorama, which I call a cranky show. It was a popular form of entertainment in the 1800s.
Well, I'll tell you what, you pick it, Maya's going to crank it, and we're going to have us a good time here.
That sounds pretty good. Here we go.
Sam, I'm sure glad you stopped by and visited with us here today. I love having musical friends stop by. If you want to hear more of your music, sambartlett.com, right? That's great. Love to hear mandolin. It's right up there with the banjo. So what are you going to play for me?
Well, I'm going to play The New Policeman, an old Irish tune, and I might go into something else.
Okay. Well, I'm glad everybody stopped by for a visit. You're always welcome here on the front porch, and This coming week, if you see someone that looks like they're really having a tough day, give them a smile. It may be the only one they get.